The court has reviewed the jury's unanimous finding. Despite the defendant's youth, the aggravating factors in this case are substantial. For the crime of first-degree murder, you are hereby sentenced to the maximum penalty allowable, life in prison. May God have mercy on your soul.
On April 20th, 2018, in Salt Lake City, Utah, 10-year-old Harper Bailey was sexually assaulted and strangled to death by 15-year-old Benjamin Anderson in his mother's apartment. The brutal attack occurred while Benjamin's 17-year-old girlfriend, Emma Wilson, had left the apartment to purchase marijuana from a dealer several blocks away. Harper's body was later found dumped in a canal off a causeway on the outskirts of the city, stuffed inside a suitcase that Benjamin had weighed down with rocks. The medical examiner would later determine that Harper died from manual strangulation after being sexually assaulted, with bruising patterns on her neck consistent with someone using their bare hands to cut off her oxygen supply. If you're watching this video, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth true crime analysis. We'd love to know where you're watching from, so drop your location in the comments below and let us know what case you'd like us to cover next. Benjamin Anderson lived with his mother in a modest apartment complex in a lower middle-class neighborhood of Salt Lake City, an area that stood in stark contrast to the pristine image the city often projects to visitors. His mother, a single parent who worked 2 jobs to support them, was at her shift at a local hospital when the crime occurred, leaving Benjamin alone in the apartment that afternoon. Victoria Murphy, a distant cousin of Harper's mother, had dropped Harper off at the apartment around 2:30 p.m., supposedly for Benjamin to watch her until Victoria returned from running errands. This arrangement, made without the knowledge of Harper's parents, would later become a crucial point of contention in the investigation and subsequent trial when Victoria initially denied having seen Harper that day. The timeline of events, pieced together through witness statements, surveillance footage, and Benjamin's eventual confession, painted a disturbing picture of premeditation, unusual for a perpetrator so young. Benjamin had invited Harper over through Victoria, who regularly helped transport neighborhood children to after-school activities and was trusted by Harper's family. Text messages recovered from Benjamin's phone revealed that he had purposely arranged for Emma to leave the apartment on a marijuana run, creating the window of opportunity he needed to be alone with the child. The messages, sent in the hours before Harper arrived, showed Benjamin calculating the timing with chilling precision, telling Emma that they needed to get high later and suggesting she go to their usual dealer around 2:45 p.m. The crime scene itself, Benjamin's mother's apartment, initially revealed very little evidence of the violent attack that had occurred there. Benjamin had meticulously cleaned the bathroom where the assault took place, using bleach to remove blood evidence and gathering all of Harper's clothing and personal items. His attention to detail was remarkable for a 15-year-old, suggesting either an unusually sophisticated understanding of forensic evidence or a frightening natural instinct for covering his tracks. Investigators would later find microscopic blood spatter on the bathroom ceiling that Benjamin had missed in his cleanup efforts, providing crucial DNA evidence linking Harper to the location. The religious community of Salt Lake City, dominated by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, reacted with profound shock as details of the crime emerged in the following days and weeks. In a city defined by strict moral codes and family values, the rape and murder of a child by another child challenged many residents' fundamental beliefs about the innocence of youth and the safety of their community. Local church leaders struggled to address the crime in their sermons, torn between condemning the act and offering compassion to all involved families who were part of their congregation. The silence from many pulpits spoke volumes about the community's inability to reconcile this horror with their worldview. Benjamin's behavior in the immediate aftermath of the crime displayed a disturbing lack of emotion or remorse that would later become a focal point for psychological evaluation. After killing Harper, he texted Emma to tell her not to rush back, saying he was just chilling and playing video games. When Emma returned approximately an hour later, Benjamin suggested they go out for fast food, acting completely normal throughout their meal at a local burger restaurant. Security footage from the restaurant showed Benjamin laughing and sharing fries with Emma, just hours after he had ended a child's life and hidden her body in a suitcase in his bedroom closet. As darkness fell on Salt Lake City that evening, Harper's parents began to worry when she failed to return home for dinner. Their initial calls to Victoria Murphy went unanswered, as Victoria was deliberately avoiding contact, knowing she had left Harper with Benjamin without permission. Around 8:30 p.m., Harper's mother called the police to report her daughter missing, setting in motion the investigation that would ultimately lead to Benjamin's arrest. The responding officers, following standard protocol, began by interviewing family members and checking with Harper's friends, still treating the case as a potential runaway or misunderstanding, rather than an abduction or homicide. Under the cover of night, while search parties were just beginning to organize, Benjamin executed the second phase of his plan to dispose of Harper's body. After midnight, when his mother had returned home and fallen asleep after her exhausting hospital shift, Benjamin quietly removed the suitcase containing Harper's body from his closet. Text records show he messaged Emma at 12:43 a.m., asking if she could borrow her mother's car and pick him up, claiming he needed to return something to his dad, who lived on the other side of town. Emma, unaware of the true contents of the suitcase, agreed and arrived at Benjamin's apartment around 1:15 a.m. The drive to the causeway took approximately 30 minutes, with Benjamin directing Emma to a secluded area where the road crossed over a deep section of canal. Traffic camera footage, later recovered by investigators, showed Emma's mother's sedan pulling to the side of the road at 1:52 a.m., with the vehicle's lights turned off shortly after. For 11 minutes, the car remained stationary before the headlights came back on and the vehicle returned toward the city. Benjamin had instructed Emma to wait in the car while he took care of something, claiming the suitcase contained illegal drugs that his father had asked him to dispose of to avoid potential legal trouble. The following morning, as search efforts for Harper intensified throughout the neighborhood, Benjamin joined a community search party organized by a local church. Several witnesses would later testify to his seemingly genuine concern and active participation in the search, with one neighbor commenting on how Benjamin had seemed especially determined to find her. This performance of innocence extended to his first interview with police later that day, where he provided his false account of giving Harper money for candy at a nearby convenience store, after which she supposedly left his apartment and never returned. The story seemed plausible enough that initial investigators noted no red flags, describing Benjamin as cooperative and forthcoming. Harper Bailey was the kind of child who made an impression on everyone she met, with a personality that seemed to fill any room she entered, despite her small stature. Born on August 12, 2007, she was the middle child of 3 siblings, sandwiched between an older brother who protected her fiercely and a younger sister who idolized her every move. Her teachers at Salt Lake City Elementary School described her as exceptionally bright, particularly in science classes where her curiosity about animals and natural systems set her apart from her peers. Harper's 4th-grade teacher, Ms. Williamson, would later testify that Harper had recently completed a project on endangered species that showed research skills and analytical thinking well beyond her years, earning her the school's Young Scientist Award just 2 weeks before her death. The Bailey family home, a modest bungalow just 6 blocks from Benjamin Anderson's apartment complex, was filled with evidence of Harper's dreams and passions. Her bedroom walls were covered with carefully arranged posters of wildlife, interspersed with her own drawings of animals she hoped to help as a veterinarian someday. A collection of well-worn veterinary textbooks, borrowed repeatedly from the local library, sat on her desk alongside notebooks filled with meticulous, childish handwriting detailing facts about different species and their habitats. The last entry in her Animal Doctor journal, dated April 19, 2018, the day before her murder, contained a drawing of a rehabilitation center she planned to build for hurt animals who need someone to care for them. Harper's parents, Robert and Michelle Bailey, had raised their children with values deeply rooted in their community and faith, with regular attendance at their local church and an emphasis on service to others. Michelle Bailey worked as a kindergarten teacher at the same elementary school Harper attended, while Robert ran a small landscaping business that serviced many homes in their neighborhood. Family friends described the Baileys as the cornerstone of their community, always the first to organize meal trains for sick neighbors or volunteer for school events. In the words of their pastor, who would later preside over Harper's funeral, the Baileys gave Harper roots in faith and wings of compassion, teaching her that every living creature deserved kindness and respect. The morning of April 20th had begun like any other in the Bailey household, with Harper bouncing out of bed early to help feed the family's 2 rescue dogs before school. Security footage from the school entrance showed Harper arriving at 8:12 a.m., her distinctive purple backpack bobbing as she skipped up the steps, stopping to hold the door open for a younger student struggling with a science project. Her final day at school was marked by ordinary moments that would later haunt her classmates and teachers. Raising her hand enthusiastically during math class, trading half her sandwich for a friend's cookies at lunch, and staying a few minutes after the final bell to help clean the classroom aquarium she had championed as a class project. What should have been a routine Friday afternoon took its fateful turn when Harper encountered Victoria Murphy outside the school. Victoria, a 24-year-old cousin of Michelle Bailey, who occasionally helped with childcare, had not been expected to pick Harper up that day. According to Harper's regular after-school schedule, she should have walked home with her older brother, but he had stayed late for baseball practice. Victoria later admitted that she had impulsively offered Harper a ride, knowing Michelle would be busy with a teachers' meeting and seeing an opportunity to curry favor with the family after a recent falling out over borrowed money she had failed to repay. Harper's closest friend, Lily Thompson, was the last classmate to see her alive, waving goodbye as Harper climbed into Victoria's blue sedan. Lily would later recall that Harper seemed excited, telling her that she might get to play with the cute boy's new puppy, a detail that would prove significant when investigators discovered that Benjamin had been telling neighborhood children he had recently gotten a dog despite his mother's building having a strict no-pets policy. This fabrication appeared to be a deliberate tactic to lure children to his home, though Harper was the only one known to have fallen victim to this ploy. The vibrant personality that defined Harper in life was painfully evident in her absence, creating a vacuum that her community struggled to comprehend. Her empty desk at school became a makeshift memorial in the days following her disappearance, covered with notes from classmates and small trinkets representing inside jokes and shared memories. Her best friend Lily placed a small ceramic frog on the desk, a reference to their secret nickname for their strict math teacher, that remained there throughout the investigation and trial, a poignant reminder of childhood innocence in stark contrast to the horrors of the case unfolding in the adult world. Harper's parents initially clung to hope in the early hours of the search, unable to conceive of the alternative to finding their daughter safe. Michelle Bailey, in her first press conference appealing for information, spoke directly to Harper through the cameras. "Sweetheart, if you can see this, please know that we love you and we just want you to come home." The raw emotion in her voice pierced through the typically reserved demeanor of the Salt Lake City news media, turning Harper's disappearance from a local concern into a statewide search within hours. By sunrise the following day, Harper's smiling school photograph was being printed on flyers and distributed throughout Utah. The community response to Harper's disappearance revealed how deeply she had touched the lives of those around her, with over 300 volunteers showing up within hours of the first call for search assistance. Among these searchers were Harper's classmates and their parents, teachers from her school, members of their church congregation, and even strangers moved by the desperate pleas of her family. One volunteer, a retired search and rescue worker, later commented that he had never seen such an immediate and massive turnout for a missing child case, attributing it to the Bailey family's standing in the community and to something special about Harper that seemed to connect with everyone, even those who had never met her. What the searchers couldn't have known as they combed through parks, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings was that Harper was already beyond their help, her body concealed in a suitcase that would later be dumped in a canal miles from their search perimeter. The disconnect between the hope driving the search and the grim reality created a particularly painful dimension to the case that would haunt the community long after the truth came to light. For 24 crucial hours, while Benjamin Anderson walked freely and even participated in the search, Harper's parents held on to the possibility of finding their daughter alive, unaware that the author of their nightmare was standing among them, offering condolences and false encouragement. The first 48 hours of Harper Bailey's disappearance were treated as a missing person case, with the Salt Lake City Police Department following standard protocols for a child who had potentially wandered off or run away. Detective Owen Clark, a 15-year veteran of the force with a specialized training in child abduction cases, was assigned as lead investigator on the morning of April the 21st, after the overnight search had failed to locate Harper. His initial assessment noted the concerning factors that distinguished this case from typical runaway situations: Harper's young age, her close relationship with her family, the absence of any history of behavioral problems, and the lack of any personal items missing from her room that might suggest planned departure. "This is not a child who packed a bag and left," Clark wrote in his preliminary report. "This is a child who expected to come home for dinner." The investigation's first significant breakthrough came from canvassing the neighborhood surrounding the Bailey home, when a resident mentioned seeing Harper getting into Victoria Murphy's car outside the school the previous afternoon. When initially questioned by uniformed officers, Victoria denied having seen Harper at all that day, a lie that would later result in obstruction of justice charges. Her deception began to unravel when school surveillance footage clearly showed Victoria's blue sedan in the pickup lane and Harper entering the vehicle at 3:15 p.m. on April 20th. When confronted with this evidence, Victoria changed her story, admitting she had given Harper a ride but claiming she had dropped her off at a convenience store near her home where Harper wanted to buy candy. The convenience store referenced by Victoria, a small family-owned market called Jensen's on the corner of Maple Street and 4th Avenue, became the next focus of the investigation. Detective Clark and his team reviewed the store's security footage, which showed no sign of Harper entering the establishment at any point that afternoon. The store owner, Mr. Jensen, and his cashier both confirmed they hadn't seen the girl that day, with Mr. Jensen noting he would have remembered Harper as she was a regular customer who often came in for animal-shaped gummies that were her favorite treat. This contradiction forced investigators to return to Victoria Murphy for further questioning, applying more pressure to her increasingly inconsistent narrative. Under intensive interrogation at Salt Lake City Police Headquarters on the evening of April 22nd, Victoria Murphy finally broke down and revealed the truth. She had taken Harper to Benjamin Anderson's apartment at the girl's request to see his supposed new puppy. Victoria admitted she knew Benjamin's mother wasn't home, but left Harper there anyway, planning to return after running some errands. When she came back approximately 2 hours later and knocked on the apartment door, Benjamin told her that Harper had already left to walk home, having given her money for candy at Jensen's on the way. Victoria, concerned about leaving a 10-year-old with a teenager unsupervised, had chosen to lie to both the Bailey family and the police rather than face potential blame. With this new information, Detective Clark immediately dispatched officers to Benjamin Anderson's apartment to interview him regarding his last contact with Harper. The 15-year-old, home alone again while his mother worked an overnight shift, appeared calm and cooperative during the initial interview. Benjamin corroborated Victoria's revised story, stating that Harper had visited briefly to see a puppy that belonged to a neighbor, adjusting his earlier fabrication when questioned directly about pet ownership, and that he had given her $5 for candy before she left his apartment around 4:30 p.m. She was fine when she left, Benjamin told officers, maintaining steady eye contact in a manner that the interviewing officer noted seemed practiced rather than natural. As the investigation intensified, a parallel search operation expanded to include the areas between Benjamin's apartment complex and the Bailey home, operating on the assumption that Harper might have met with foul play somewhere along that route. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search dumpsters, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings within a 1-mile radius of both locations. On the morning of April 23rd, 3 days after Harper's disappearance, a significant development occurred when one of the search teams discovered a girl's hair ribbon matching the one Harper had been wearing in school surveillance footage, found in a trash can 2 blocks from Benjamin's apartment. The ribbon, confirmed by Michelle Bailey as belonging to her daughter, showed traces of blood that preliminary testing indicated was human. The discovery of the ribbon elevated the case from a missing person investigation to a probable homicide, dramatically changing the resources allocated and the focus of law enforcement efforts. Detective Clark obtained warrants to search both Benjamin Anderson's and Victoria Murphy's residences thoroughly. While the search of Victoria's small studio apartment yielded nothing of evidentiary value, the examination of the Anderson apartment produced several critical pieces of evidence, despite Benjamin's efforts to clean the scene. Luminol testing revealed significant blood evidence in the bathroom that had been cleaned with bleach but still contained DNA traces that would later be confirmed as Harper's. Additionally, fibers found in the bathroom drain matched the clothing Harper had been wearing when she disappeared. As these discoveries were being processed, a separate breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A maintenance worker checking water levels at a canal control station approximately 8 miles from the city center noticed a child's shoe floating near a grate. The worker, recognizing the potential significance from news reports about the missing girl, immediately contacted police. Dive teams deployed to the location recovered not only the matching shoe, confirmed as Harper's by her parents, but also discovered a large suitcase submerged in the deeper section of the canal, about 50 yards upstream from the control station. The weighted suitcase, when carefully retrieved and opened by forensic personnel, contained the body of Harper Bailey, still dressed in the clothes she had worn to school 3 days earlier. The autopsy, conducted by Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Rebecca Winters on the afternoon of April 23rd, determined that Harper had died from manual strangulation, with distinct finger-shaped bruising patterns on her neck. The examination also confirmed that Harper had been sexually assaulted prior to death, with evidence of trauma and the presence of DNA that would later be matched to Benjamin Anderson. Most significantly for the investigation, Dr. Winters discovered partially dissolved candy still present in Harper's mouth and teeth, the same type of animal-shaped gummies she was known to purchase at Jensen's store. This crucial detail directly contradicted Benjamin's claim that he had given Harper money to buy candy before she left his apartment, as the candy in her mouth indicated she had already purchased and was consuming candy before her death. The candy evidence became the linchpin of the investigation, representing the critical foundational clue that unraveled Benjamin's carefully constructed false narrative. Detective Clark immediately recognized the significance. If Harper already had Candy in her possession when she was killed, then she couldn't have left Benjamin's apartment to go buy candy with the money he claimed to have given her. This physical evidence, combined with the timeline established through cell phone records, witness statements, and surveillance footage, created a definitive sequence of events that placed Harper in Benjamin's apartment at the time of her death, with no possibility of her having left alive as he had claimed. As the evidence mounted, Detective Clark arranged for a more formal interview with Benjamin Anderson, this time with his mother present as required for a juvenile suspect. The interview, conducted at police headquarters rather than the Anderson apartment, was strategically planned to confront Benjamin with the evidence in a controlled environment where his reactions could be carefully observed and recorded. The detective deliberately withheld information about the discovery of Harper's body during the initial phase of the interview, allowing Benjamin to repeat and elaborate on his original story while unknowingly contradicting physical evidence already in police possession. This investigative technique would prove invaluable in breaking down Benjamin's facade and eventually leading to his confession. Detective Owen Clark had spent 15 years in law enforcement, the last 7 specializing in crimes against children, but something about Benjamin Anderson's demeanor during their second interview triggered his investigative instincts in a way few cases had before. Watching the teenager calmly recount his story about giving Harper money for candy before she left his apartment, Clark noted the complete absence of the nervous tics and inconsistencies typical of teenage liars. He was too perfect, Clark would later testify, too rehearsed, like he'd practiced his story in front of a mirror. The detective deliberately avoided revealing what they had found in the canal, instead focusing on small details of Benjamin's timeline, looking for cracks in his carefully constructed narrative. The breakthrough came when Clark casually mentioned that security cameras at Jensen's convenience store showed no sign of Harper that afternoon, watching as a momentary flash of calculation crossed Benjamin's face before he smoothly adjusted his story. "Oh, she must have gone to the other store then, the one on Birch Street," Benjamin replied, naming a shop that investigators already knew had been closed for renovation that week. This improvised lie, easily disproven, became the first visible crack in Benjamin's facade, a tactical error that Clark immediately recognized as the opening he needed. "That's interesting," the detective responded, maintaining a conversational tone while his partner quietly left the room to verify the store's status, "because I thought that place was closed for remodeling." While Benjamin scrambled to adjust his story again, Detective Clark subtly shifted the focus to Harper's personal belongings, asking if she had been carrying anything when she visited the apartment. Benjamin claimed she had only her little purple backpack, a detail he couldn't have known unless he had seen her after school, as the backpack color hadn't been mentioned in any public reports about her disappearance. This slip further strengthened Clark's conviction that Benjamin was directly involved in Harper's disappearance, providing another piece of evidence that contradicted his claim of only brief, casual contact with the victim that day. When Clark's partner returned to confirm the Birch Street store had indeed been closed, Benjamin visibly tensed, his practiced calm beginning to fracture under the weight of accumulating contradictions. The interview strategy took a dramatic turn when Clark placed photographs of the recovered suitcase on the table, watching Benjamin's face closely for a reaction. Though the teenager maintained his composure, instruments monitoring his heart rate and perspiration showed significant spikes, physiological responses he couldn't control despite his practiced exterior calm. "Do you recognize this suitcase, Benjamin?" Clark asked, noting how the boy's eyes lingered on the image before he shook his head. When Clark revealed it had been found in the canal containing Harper's body, Benjamin's mother gasped and began to cry, while Benjamin himself remained unnaturally still, his only reaction a slight tightening of his jaw. As the evidence mounted against Benjamin, investigators turned their attention to establishing a more detailed timeline of April 20th, the day of Harper's disappearance. Cell phone records showed that Benjamin had indeed orchestrated his girlfriend Emma's absence, with text messages confirming he had suggested she go buy marijuana at precisely the time Victoria would be dropping Harper off. Emma, initially reluctant to speak with police, eventually confirmed that Benjamin had been unusually insistent that she leave to make the drug purchase at that specific time, even giving her extra money to get enough for the weekend. When she returned approximately 45 minutes later, she found Benjamin in the shower, with the apartment smelling strongly of cleaning products. Surveillance footage from businesses and traffic cameras in the vicinity of Benjamin's apartment complex filled in crucial gaps in the timeline, showing Victoria Murphy's blue sedan arriving with Harper at 2:37 p.m. and departing without her at 2:42 p.m. The same cameras captured Emma Wilson leaving on foot at 3:05 p.m. and returning at 3:52 p.m., establishing a 47-minute window during which Benjamin was alone with Harper. Most damning was footage from a bank ATM directly across from the apartment complex's main entrance, which had a partial view of the building's front door. It showed no sign of Harper exiting during the time frame when Benjamin claimed she had left to walk home. The forensic evidence recovered from Benjamin's apartment, despite his cleaning efforts, painted a disturbing picture of what had occurred in those 47 minutes. Trace blood evidence found in the bathroom drain, on the bathroom ceiling, and in grout lines of the tile floor all matched Harper's DNA profile. Fibers from her clothing were discovered embedded in the bathroom doorframe, consistent with a struggle. In the bedroom, investigators using alternative light sources detected bodily fluid stains on the carpet beside Benjamin's bed, also matching Harper's DNA, along with a partial fingerprint in blood on the underside of the bed frame that was later identified as Harper's. These findings directly contradicted Benjamin's claim that Harper had merely visited briefly to see a puppy before leaving. The most conclusive piece of physical evidence linking Benjamin to Harper's murder came from the suitcase itself. The large rolling luggage belonged to Benjamin's mother, who confirmed it had been in her bedroom closet the morning of April 20th, but she hadn't noticed its absence until police questioned her about it. Forensic examination of the suitcase interior revealed a wealth of trace evidence: Harper's hair and fibers from her clothing throughout the lining, transfer stains from her injuries, and most significantly, Benjamin's fingerprints and DNA on both the interior and exterior surfaces. The rocks used to weigh down the suitcase matched the geological profile of decorative landscaping stones from the flower beds outside the Anderson apartment building, with security footage showing Benjamin collecting these stones late at night on April 20th. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery came from Benjamin's online activity in the weeks leading up to Harper's murder. Digital forensic specialists examining his devices found evidence of deleted searches for how to delete browsing history, how long does DNA last, and can bleach destroy evidence. More alarmingly, his search history revealed a pattern of interest in websites depicting violence against young girls, with searches specifically for young girl struggling and unconscious girl occurring with increasing frequency in the month before Harper's death. These digital breadcrumbs suggested not only premeditation, but a troubling escalation in Benjamin's thoughts and interests leading up to the crime. Emma Wilson, initially reluctant to implicate her boyfriend, became an increasingly important witness as she gradually revealed more details about Benjamin's behavior before and after Harper's disappearance. In her third interview with detectives, Emma admitted that Benjamin had asked her to lie about their whereabouts on the evening of April 20th, creating a false alibi about them attending a movie together. More significantly, she confirmed that Benjamin had asked to borrow her mother's car just after midnight. claiming he needed to return something to his father. It was during this late-night excursion that investigators now believed Benjamin had transported Harper's body to the canal, with Emma unwittingly serving as his accomplice. The canal location where Harper's body was found took on new significance when investigators discovered its connection to Benjamin's past. The specific causeway was a fishing spot where Benjamin had frequently gone with his father before his parents divorced 2 years earlier. This personal connection to the disposal site further strengthened the case against Benjamin, suggesting he had chosen a familiar location where he knew the water was deep enough to conceal the suitcase. Traffic camera footage confirmed that Emma's mother's car had traveled the route to the causeway at the time Benjamin claimed to be returning something to his father, with the vehicle remaining stationary at the site for 11 minutes before returning toward the city. As investigators pieced together the evidence, a disturbing profile of Benjamin Anderson began to emerge that contradicted his public image as an ordinary, if somewhat quiet, teenager. Teachers and classmates described him as intelligent but socially awkward, often observing others rather than participating. His academic record showed consistently high grades in science and mathematics, but troubling themes in his creative writing assignments that had apparently gone unnoticed or unreported. A former girlfriend described controlling behavior and sudden mood shifts, while his social media accounts revealed a carefully curated public persona that bore little resemblance to the disturbing content found in his private browsing history. By the 5th day of the investigation, Detective Clark had assembled enough evidence to present to the district attorney's office, resulting in an arrest warrant for Benjamin Anderson. The decision to charge the 15-year-old as an adult was made based on the premeditated nature of the crime, the sexual assault component, and the calculated efforts to conceal evidence. On April 25, 2018, just 5 days after Harper Bailey's disappearance, Benjamin Anderson was taken into custody at his high school, led away in handcuffs as shocked classmates watched. The public arrest, while unusual for a juvenile, was a strategic decision by the prosecution team to emphasize the seriousness with which the justice system was treating the case. The case against Benjamin Anderson grew stronger as investigators continued to uncover evidence connecting him directly to Harper Bailey's murder. Forensic analysis of the candy found in Harper's teeth became a central focus, with experts determining it was indeed from a package of the animal-shaped gummies she frequently purchased. The half-dissolved state of the candy indicated Harper had been eating it shortly before her death, directly contradicting Benjamin's claim that he had given her money to buy candy after she left his apartment. Lab tests confirmed the candy contained the specific dye formulation used by the manufacturer of Harper's favorite brand, sold at Jensen's convenience store, where store records showed a purchase matching Harper's usual selection made earlier that day when she had stopped there with her classmate before school. Victoria Murphy's role in the events leading to Harper's death became clearer through extensive interviews with both Victoria and Harper's family members. As investigators delved into their relationship, they discovered that Victoria, a single mother struggling financially, had been growing increasingly dependent on the Bailey family for support. Michelle Bailey had recently confronted Victoria about missing money from her purse, creating tension that Victoria was attempting to alleviate by offering to help with child care. Cell phone records revealed that Victoria had texted Benjamin that morning asking if his mother would be home that afternoon, indicating she had pre-planned bringing Harper to the apartment, despite later claiming it was Harper's spontaneous request to see the puppy. The motive for Benjamin's actions began to emerge through analysis of his social media accounts, text messages, and interviews with his girlfriend Emma Wilson. In the weeks leading up to the murder, Benjamin had become increasingly obsessed with violent pornography involving young-looking females, with his searches growing more specific and disturbing over time. Emma reluctantly admitted to investigators that Benjamin had recently begun asking her to dress and act younger during intimate moments, a request that had made her uncomfortable enough to consider ending their relationship. When she threatened to break up with him 2 days before Harper's murder, Benjamin had become despondent, telling her he needed her and couldn't be alone, suggesting a triggering event that may have accelerated his already dangerous thoughts. Detective Clark's theory, supported by forensic psychologists consulting on the case, was that Benjamin had orchestrated Harper's visit as an opportunity to act on his violent sexual fantasies during a time when he knew he would have complete privacy. The calculated nature of his actions, ensuring his mother was at work, sending Emma on an errand, and confirming through Victoria that Harper would be coming over, demonstrated a level of premeditation unusual in adolescent offenders. Text messages between Benjamin and Emma revealed his repeated mentions of needing her to go get weed specifically that afternoon, with unusual insistence that she take her time and get the good stuff from the guy across town, rather than their usual nearby source. The physical evidence from the Anderson apartment told a harrowing story of Harper's final moments, with blood spatter analysis indicating the initial assault began in the living room but escalated in violence in the bathroom. Microscopic examination of the bathroom doorframe showed defensive transfer marks consistent with Harper trying to grab the door while being pulled away from it, with her broken fingernail embedded in the wood, providing both DNA evidence and a testament to her desperate struggle. The positioning of blood drops on the bathroom ceiling suggested Harper had been lifted off the floor during the strangulation, a detail that matched the autopsy findings of bruising patterns on her neck and shoulder, indicating she had been held up against a wall while being strangled. Toxicology reports from Harper's autopsy revealed another disturbing element of the crime: trace amounts of a prescription sedative in her system that matched medication prescribed to Benjamin's mother for anxiety. Pill counts from the bottle in the Anderson apartment showed 3 tablets missing from the expected number, based on prescription date and dosage. Investigators theorized that Benjamin had given Harper the medication, possibly crushed in a drink, to make her more compliant before the assault. The dosage was not high enough to be fatal, but would have significantly impaired a child of Harper's size, explaining why neighbors reported hearing no screams or signs of struggle, despite the violence evident in the physical evidence. Emma Wilson's testimony about the aftermath of the crime provided crucial context for Benjamin's state of mind following Harper's murder. Emma described his behavior that evening as unusually energetic and affectionate, suggesting a form of emotional release. "He kept wanting to take selfies together and posting about how much he loved me," Emma told investigators, scrolling through social media posts Benjamin had made in the hours after. Killing Harper. The performative nature of this behavior, creating a public record of seeming normalcy, indicated awareness of wrongdoing and deliberate attempts to establish an alternative narrative, sophisticated counter-detection measures that concerned investigators given Benjamin's young age. The suitcase used to transport Harper's body yielded additional evidence connecting Benjamin directly to the crime. Fiber analysis showed that the suitcase lining contained not only fibers from Harper's clothing, but also from Benjamin's bedroom carpet, placing the suitcase in his room after Harper's death. GPS data from Emma's mother's car, combined with cell tower pings from Benjamin's phone, created a precise timeline of the journey to dispose of the body, showing the exact route taken to the causeway and the 11-minute stop where the suitcase was dumped into the canal. Surveillance video from a distant gas station camera, enhanced by FBI technical specialists, showed a grainy but identifiable image of what appeared to be Benjamin struggling with a large object at the causeway railing, corresponding exactly to the GPS data's timestamp. Perhaps most damning for Benjamin's defense was the recovery of his internet search history, despite his attempts to delete it from his devices. In the week before Harper's murder, He had searched for information on how long it takes a body to decompose in water, whether DNA can survive underwater, and specific queries about the depth of several local waterways, including the exact canal where Harper was found. These searches, combined with location data showing Benjamin had visited the Causeway area twice in the week before the murder, painted a clear picture of premeditation and planning that would later prove devastating to his defense team's efforts to portray the crime as an impulsive act by an immature adolescent. Victoria Murphy's complicity in the events leading to Harper's death became a secondary but significant focus of the investigation. While there was no evidence she had knowledge of Benjamin's intentions, her decision to leave a 10-year-old child with a teenage boy she barely knew in an apartment without adult supervision represented a serious lapse in judgment with tragic consequences. More troubling was her immediate instinct to lie to both the family and police about having seen Harper that day, potentially delaying the search in crucial early hours when Harper might still have been found alive if Benjamin had not yet disposed of her body. Cell phone records revealed that Victoria had driven past the Anderson apartment again around 4:15 p.m., but did not stop or attempt to check on Harper, despite claiming she had returned to pick her up. As the prosecution built their case in preparation for trial, Benjamin's lack of prior criminal history emerged as a double-edged factor. While his clean record would typically be mitigating, psychological experts noted that the sudden escalation to extreme violence without a pattern of prior offenses was actually more concerning from a risk assessment perspective. This is not a case of gradual escalation that might have been detected and interrupted, forensic psychologist Dr. Eliza Morgan noted in her report to the prosecution, but rather a young man who managed to completely compartmentalize his violent fantasies until acting on them in a fully formed, premeditated manner. This assessment, combined with the calculated nature of both the crime and cover-up, would become central to the prosecution's argument that Benjamin represented an ongoing danger despite his youth. The arrest of Benjamin Anderson took place on April 25, 2018, in the crowded hallway of Salt Lake City East High School, as classes were changing, witnessed by dozens of his stunned classmates. Detective Owen Clark had deliberately chosen this public setting for tactical reasons, hoping the shock and humiliation might break through Benjamin's carefully maintained composure. Two uniformed officers flanked the detective as he approached Benjamin at his locker, speaking loudly enough for nearby students to hear, "Benjamin Anderson, you're under arrest for the murder of Harper Bailey." The teenager's face remained impassive as he was handcuffed, his only visible reaction a quick glance toward a group of girls, watching in horror as the officers recited his Miranda rights in full view of the growing crowd. The drive to police headquarters was conducted in complete silence, with Benjamin staring straight ahead as Detective Clark made pointed observations about passing landmarks. "We're crossing the causeway now," Clark remarked casually as they drove over the canal where Harper's body had been found, watching in the rearview mirror for any reaction from his suspect. Benjamin's continued stoicism concerned rather than reassured the detective, who had expected the reality of arrest to crack the teenager's facade. "Most kids his age would be in tears by now," Clark later noted in his case file, asking for their parents, showing fear, anger, something. His flatness of affect is more consistent with adult offenders I've arrested for similar crimes. Benjamin's mother was already waiting at the interrogation room, having been notified of her son's arrest as required by law for a juvenile suspect. Susan Anderson, a registered nurse who had raised Benjamin alone since his father left when he was 13, appeared shell-shocked, her hospital scrubs suggesting she had rushed directly from her shift when contacted by police. "There has to be some mistake," she repeated as Detective Clark entered, her voice breaking as she reached for her son's hand across the table. Benjamin withdrew his hand subtly, focusing instead on the folder of evidence Clark placed between them, his eyes tracking the detective's movements with an analytical intensity that seemed inappropriate for a 15-year-old in his position. The interrogation began with Detective Clark methodically laying out the timeline they had established, placing photographs on the table as he spoke. Victoria Murphy's car arriving at Benjamin's apartment building with Harper inside, Emma leaving to buy marijuana, the lack of any footage showing Harper exiting the building. Benjamin maintained his original story that Harper had left to buy candy, adding details about which direction she had walked and what she had been wearing, seemingly unaware that these new specifics could be disproven by the existing evidence. His mother listened with increasing distress, her eyes moving between her son's calm face and the damning photographs arranged before them. The turning point came when Clark placed a final image on the table, a close-up photograph of Harper's mouth during the autopsy, clearly showing the partially dissolved animal-shaped candy lodged between her teeth. "This is where your story falls apart, Benjamin," Clark said quietly, tapping the photograph with his index finger. "Harper already had candy when she died, the same candy she bought at Jensen's on her way to school that morning. She never left your apartment to buy candy with money you gave her because she was already dead." The detective leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "The candy tells us everything, Benjamin. It tells us you're lying." For the first time since his arrest, Benjamin's composure visibly faltered, a flash of anger crossing his face before he controlled it, his hands curling into fists beneath the table. "That doesn't prove anything," he responded, his voice slightly higher than its usual register. His mother, however, had begun to cry silently beside him, the reality of the evidence seemingly penetrating her denial where her son's arrest had not. Detective Clark continued to build on this momentum, next producing the hair ribbon found in the trash can near Benjamin's apartment, now in an evidence bag. "Harper's blood is on this ribbon, Benjamin, the ribbon she was wearing in her hair when Victoria dropped her at your apartment." Susan Anderson broke her silence, turning to face her son directly. "Tell them the truth, Benjamin," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, just tell them what really happened." Benjamin shot his mother a look of such cold contempt that she physically recoiled, a moment that Detective Clark would later describe as the most revealing of the entire interrogation. The fact that the candy was still in her mouth actually suggests she died very shortly after arriving at your apartment, Clark continued, deliberately using language that framed Harper's death as an established fact rather than an allegation, which contradicts your claim that she stayed to visit and then left. The interrogation strategy shifted as Benjamin's initial story crumbled, with Detective Clark now focusing on minimization techniques commonly used with juvenile suspects. "I understand things can happen in the moment, Benjamin, that sometimes we don't mean for things to go as far as they do," he suggested, offering an implicit opportunity for Benjamin to claim the killing was accidental rather than premeditated. This approach seemed to resonate with Benjamin, who glanced at his mother before leaning forward slightly. "She was going to tell on me," he said quietly, a statement that immediately caught both his mother and the detective's full attention. What followed was a chilling confession that unfolded over the next 2 hours, with Benjamin methodically describing how he had planned and executed Harper's murder with a level of detail and emotional detachment that visibly disturbed everyone in the room, including the experienced detective. Benjamin admitted to asking Victoria to bring Harper over, knowing his mother would be at work and having arranged for Emma to leave. He described giving Harper a drink containing crushed anxiety medication to make her sleepy before attempting to assault her in his bedroom. When Harper resisted and threatened to tell her parents, Benjamin described strangling her with his bare hands until she stopped moving. His description of the mechanics of strangulation, demonstrating disturbing knowledge of human anatomy. The most unsettling aspect of Benjamin's confession was not the details of the murder itself, but his explanation of the extensive measures he took to conceal it. He described cleaning the bathroom with bleach, collecting all physical evidence in a garbage bag, and disposing of it in a dumpster behind a restaurant several blocks away, and storing Harper's body in his closet until he could arrange for Emma to unwittingly help him dispose of it. "I knew I'd need a car to take her somewhere far from the apartment," he explained in the same tone one might use to describe a school project. "So I waited until my mom was asleep and texted Emma to come over." His description of weighing down the suitcase with rocks, selecting the causeway for its deep water, and ensuring no other cars were around when he pushed the suitcase over the railing revealed a level of calculated planning that contradicted any notion of a momentary lapse in judgment. Throughout his confession, Benjamin showed brief flashes of emotion only when describing his frustration at potential errors in his plan, anger at Victoria for returning to check on Harper earlier than expected, annoyance at having to improvise an explanation for Emma about why they needed her mother's car in the middle of the night, and concern about whether the suitcase would sync properly with the rocks he had selected. His effect remained flat when describing Harper's actual suffering and death, referring to her in dehumanizing terms as it once she was deceased. This dissociative language raised immediate red flags for the forensic psychologist observing the interrogation through a one-way mirror, who made notes about Benjamin's apparent lack of empathy and potential antisocial traits. Susan Anderson's reaction to her son's confession evolved from initial disbelief to horror as the details accumulated, finally culminating in a breakdown where she had to be briefly removed from the interrogation room. When she returned, her demeanor toward Benjamin had fundamentally changed, the protective maternal instinct replaced by something closer to fear as she regarded the stranger her son had revealed himself to be. "How could you do this?" she asked him during a pause in the questioning, searching his face for any sign of the child she thought she knew. Benjamin's response, a shrug and the words, "I wanted to see what it would feel like," caused his mother to physically recoil from him, a reaction that seemed to trigger the first genuine emotion from Benjamin, a flash of hurt quickly masked by returning coldness. The final phase of the interrogation focused on Benjamin's understanding of the consequences of his actions, both for Harper and her family, and for himself. Detective Clark deliberately employed morally loaded language, describing the devastation of the Bailey family and the impact on the community, watching for signs of remorse or empathy from the teenager. Benjamin's responses remained clinical and self-focused, primarily concerned with what would happen to him now and whether he would be tried as an adult. When asked directly if he felt sorry for what he had done to Harper, Benjamin paused before responding, "I'm sorry I got caught," a statement so jarring that his own mother gasped audibly beside him. The interrogation concluded with Benjamin providing a written statement, penned in neat, controlled handwriting, that matched the composed manner in which he had delivered his confession. The statement, later entered into evidence, contained phrases that would prove particularly damning at trial. "I knew it was wrong, but I wanted to do it anyway. And I wasn't angry at Harper, but I needed her to stop talking, so I kept squeezing until she couldn't." These admissions of clear intent, combined with the evidence of premeditation from his internet searches and the calculated steps to conceal the crime, formed the foundation of the prosecution's argument that Benjamin, despite his age, had committed an adult-like crime deserving of adult punishment. As Benjamin was processed for transfer to juvenile detention pending charging decisions, Detective Clark had a final conversation with Susan Anderson in the hallway outside the interrogation room. The detective, a father himself, attempted to offer some comfort to the devastated woman, assuring her that Benjamin's actions were not her fault. Susan, her nurse's training perhaps giving her a clearer perspective than most parents would have in her situation, looked through the window at her son being fingerprinted with the same detached expression he had maintained throughout his confession. "I've taken care of children all my life," she told Clark quietly, "and I know when someone is broken beyond repair. I just never thought that someone would be my own child. The Utah State Courthouse in Salt Lake City stood as a monument to justice and order, its imposing granite facade a stark contrast to the emotional chaos that filled its chambers on September 10, 2018, the first day of Benjamin Anderson's trial. 5 months had passed since Harper Bailey's body had been found in the canal. 5 months during which the prosecution and defense had prepared for what the local media was calling the trial that would test the limits of juvenile justice. The decision to try Benjamin as an adult had been made in June after a series of contentious hearings, with Judge Martha Simmons ruling that the premeditated nature of the crime, coupled with the sexual assault component, removed the case from the rehabilitative purview of juvenile court. At 15 years old, Benjamin Anderson would face the same charges and potential penalties as any adult defendant, including the possibility of the death penalty. The courtroom was divided like a battlefield, with Harper's family and supporters filling the benches behind the prosecution table, many wearing purple ribbons, Harper's favorite color, pinned to their clothing. Behind the defense table sat only Benjamin's mother, Susan Anderson, isolated in her grief and shame, with several empty rows separating her from other spectators, as if her son's actions had created a contagion no one dared approach. Benjamin himself entered the courtroom in a navy blue suit that hung slightly loose on his frame, the months in detention having thinned his already lanky teenage build. Gone was the impassive mask he had maintained during his interrogation, replaced by a carefully crafted appearance of contrition that Detective Owen Clark, seated at the prosecution table, immediately recognized as another performance. Prosecutor Abigail Davis, a veteran of the district attorney's office with 20 years of experience trying violent crime cases, approached the jury box with measured steps, her crimson blazer a deliberate choice meant to command authority without appearing aggressive. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice clear in the hushed courtroom, "this case is about a little girl who trusted a boy she knew from her neighborhood, a boy who gave her candy, lured her into his home, and then took everything from her innocence, her future, and her life." Davis paused, allowing the 12 jurors, 7 women and 5 men, all carefully selected through a rigorous vetting process, to absorb the gravity of her words before continuing, "And when you hear the evidence in this case, you will understand that Benjamin Anderson's age is the only childlike thing about him." The prosecution's opening statement methodically outlined the timeline of April 20th, 2018, using a large digital display to show the jury surveillance images, maps, and photographs as Davis narrated Harper's final hours. She emphasized the physical evidence that would be presented, the candy in Harper's teeth that contradicted Benjamin's initial story, the blood evidence found in the Anderson apartment, despite Benjamin's cleaning efforts, and the suitcase containing Harper's body with Benjamin's fingerprints both inside and out. But perhaps most disturbing, Davis continued, her voice dropping slightly, will be the evidence of premeditation, the internet searches, the calculated creation of privacy by sending his girlfriend away, the careful selection of the disposal site, and the elaborate cover-up that followed. Davis then introduced what she called the most damning evidence of all, Benjamin's own confession, which she characterized as showing not the impulsive actions of an immature teenager, but the calculated decisions of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and took steps to avoid being caught. She played a brief audio clip from the interrogation, Benjamin's voice filling the courtroom with the chilling phrase, "I knew it was wrong, but I wanted to do it anyway," causing several jurors to visibly flinch. Harper's mother, seated directly behind the prosecution table, closed her eyes tightly at the sound of her daughter's killer's voice, her husband's arm tightening around her shoulders in silent support. The defense attorney, Martin Reynolds, a specialist in juvenile criminal defense, who had taken Benjamin's case pro bono, approached the jury with a deliberate humility that contrasted with the prosecution's authoritative presence. "What happened to Harper Bailey was a tragedy beyond words," he began, acknowledging the gravity of the crime rather than attempting to minimize it. "Nothing I say today will or should diminish the pain her family feels or the horror of what occurred." Reynolds then pivoted to his central argument. "But this case is also about another child, a 15-year-old boy with an undeveloped brain, a child whose thought processes and impulse control are fundamentally different from those of the adults this court is designed to judge." Reynolds introduced the concept of adolescent brain development, explaining that scientific research had conclusively demonstrated that the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for judgment, decision-making, and understanding consequences, remains undeveloped until the mid-20s. Benjamin's actions, as terrible as they were, must be understood in the context of a brain that literally cannot process information the way yours or mine does, he told the jury, gesturing to include himself and the prosecutor. "This is not an excuse, but a biological reality that our justice system must account for." Several jurors nodded thoughtfully, while others maintained skeptical expressions, already forming impressions that would guide their reception of the evidence to come. The defense strategy became clearer as Reynolds addressed the premeditation evidence, arguing that Benjamin's internet searches and attempts to cover up the crime demonstrated not adult-like calculation, but adolescent magical thinking, the belief that simple solutions could make complex problems disappear. "What you will see is not sophisticated planning, but a scared child making increasingly poor decisions, each one an attempt to undo the last," Reynolds suggested, careful to maintain a tone of sorrow rather than justification. "Benjamin Anderson needs punishment and intensive treatment, yes, but he also deserves to be judged as what he is, a child who did a terrible thing, not an adult who happens to be young." Judge Simmons, a stern woman in her 60s with a reputation for running efficient courtrooms, interrupted at this point to remind both attorneys and the jury that arguments were not evidence and that their decision must be based solely on the facts presented during the trial. Her measured tone carried the weight of her 30 years on the bench, commanding immediate attention from everyone present. "This court understands the emotional nature of this case," she stated, looking directly at the jury. "But justice requires that emotions not override reason, no matter how difficult that may be." With that admonition, she called for the prosecution to present its first witness, setting in motion a trial that would test not only Benjamin Anderson's guilt, but society's approach to juvenile violence. The prosecution's first witness was Victoria Murphy, the woman who had left Harper with Benjamin that fateful afternoon. Victoria entered the courtroom with visible reluctance, her eyes downcast and her shoulders hunched, as if to make herself smaller under the weight of public scrutiny. Already convicted of obstruction of justice for her initial lies to police, Victoria was serving a 2-year probation sentence that included mandatory community service at a child safety organization, a punishment designed to remind her daily of the consequences of her negligence. Her testimony would be crucial to establishing the timeline and Benjamin's opportunity to commit the crime. Under Prosecutor Davis's questioning, Victoria recounted how she had picked Harper up from school without the Bailey family's knowledge or permission, intending to curry favor by allowing the child to visit Benjamin's supposed new puppy. She was so excited, Victoria testified, her voice breaking as she recalled Harper's enthusiasm. She loved animals more than anything. Victoria admitted she knew Benjamin's mother wasn't home, but left Harper there anyway, planning to return after running errands. When she came back approximately 2 hours later and knocked on the apartment door, Benjamin told her Harper had already left to walk home, having given her money for candy. Victoria's poor decision to leave a child with an unsupervised teenager, followed by her choice to lie rather than raise an immediate alarm when Harper couldn't be found, had created the perfect conditions for Benjamin to commit and temporarily conceal his crime. Defense attorney Reynolds cross-examined Victoria with surprising gentleness, establishing that she had no reason to suspect Benjamin posed any danger to Harper and that his behavior when she returned to the apartment had seemed normal and unremarkable. Did Benjamin seem agitated, nervous, or different in any way when you came back? Reynolds asked. Victoria shook her head, describing Benjamin as the same quiet kid he always was, a characterization that Reynolds would later use to support his argument about adolescent compartmentalization and the difficulty of recognizing dangerous tendencies in teenagers. Victoria left the stand visibly shaken, casting a glance toward the Bailey family that was met with cold stares, her own complicity in Harper's death still raw for those who had loved the little girl. The prosecution's case continued with testimony from Emma Wilson, Benjamin's former girlfriend, who provided crucial evidence about his behavior before and after Harper's murder. Now 16 and clearly uncomfortable in the formal setting of the courtroom, Emma described how Benjamin had insisted she leave to buy marijuana at the specific time Harper would be at the apartment. He gave me extra money and told me to go to the dealer across town instead of our usual guy, she testified, her voice barely audible until Judge Simmons gently asked her to speak up. When I got back, he was just getting out of the shower and the apartment smelled like bleach. He said he had spilled something and had to clean it up. Emma's most damning testimony concerned the disposal of Harper's body, as she described how Benjamin had texted her after midnight, asking to borrow her mother's car to return something to his dad. Fighting tears, Emma recounted driving Benjamin to the causeway, waiting in the car while he struggled with the heavy suitcase, and then driving him home, all without knowing she was helping conceal a murder. He was so normal on the drive back, Emma said, her voice breaking. He held my hand and talked about going to prom next year. The jurors' expressions hardened at this detail, the casual planning for the future, while Harper's body sank into the canal, striking many as the clearest evidence of Benjamin's disturbing lack of remorse or normal emotional response. The prosecution methodically built its case over the next 3 days, calling the medical examiner who confirmed Harper died from strangulation after being sexually assaulted, forensic experts who detailed the blood and DNA evidence found in Benjamin's apartment despite his cleaning efforts, and digital specialists who presented Benjamin's disturbing internet search history. Each witness added another layer to the portrait of a calculated crime, with Prosecutor Davis skillfully guiding their testimony to emphasize both the premeditation involved and the suffering Harper must have experienced. Throughout these graphic presentations, Benjamin maintained a carefully neutral expression, occasionally writing notes to his attorney, but showing no visible reaction to even the most disturbing evidence, a demeanor that several jurors were observed watching closely. By the end of the first week, the prosecution had established a timeline of the crime that left little room for doubt about Benjamin's actions or his efforts to conceal them. The foundational Candy evidence, which had initially cracked his false narrative, was given particular emphasis through the testimony of Dr. Rebecca Winters, the chief medical examiner. Using enlarged photographs and dental models, Dr. Winters explained how the partially dissolved animal-shaped gummies found in Harper's teeth could only have been there if she died shortly after consuming them, directly contradicting Benjamin's claim that she had left his apartment to buy candy with money he had given her. As the trial entered its second week, the defense began presenting its case, calling child psychologists and neurological experts to testify about adolescent brain development and its implications for criminal responsibility. Dr. Marcus Hendricks, a leading researcher in the field, used colorful brain scans to show the jury the physical differences between adolescent and adult brains, particularly in regions responsible for impulse control and consequence assessment. The science is clear, Dr. Hendricks testified. Teenagers, even intelligent ones, simply lack the neurological hardware to process decisions the way adults do, especially in emotionally charged situations. This testimony supported the defense's core argument that Benjamin, despite the heinousness of his actions, should not be held to the same standard of culpability as an adult. Throughout the expert testimony, Benjamin sat attentively beside his attorney, nodding occasionally at technical explanations as if to demonstrate his intellectual engagement with the concepts being discussed. This calculated performance of maturity and comprehension did not go unnoticed by Detective Clark, who leaned over to whisper to Prosecutor Davis, "He's still playing a role, still manipulating." Davis nodded slightly, making a note to address this behavior in her closing argument. The contrast between Benjamin's apparent intellectual sophistication during expert testimony and the defense's argument about his immature brain development created a tension that would become a central point of contention as the trial progressed toward its conclusion. The 8th day of Benjamin Anderson's trial marked a turning point as the prosecution called Dr. Rebecca Winters, the chief medical examiner for Salt Lake County, to provide what would become the most scientifically damning testimony regarding the foundational candy evidence. Dr. Winters, a forensic pathologist with over 20 years of experience, approached the witness stand with the measured confidence of someone accustomed to explaining complex medical findings to laypeople. Dressed in a conservative charcoal suit with her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, she projected an image of unimpeachable professionalism that immediately commanded the jury's attention. Prosecutor Davis began by establishing Dr. Winters' extensive credentials before directing her testimony toward the specific findings from Harper Bailey's autopsy that contradicted Benjamin Anderson's initial story about giving the girl money for candy before she left his apartment. Dr. Winters, could you please explain to the jury what you discovered in the victim's mouth during your examination? Davis asked, her voice deliberately even, despite the disturbing nature of the question. Dr. Winters nodded and explained, "During the autopsy of Harper Bailey, I found partially dissolved candy in her mouth and between her teeth, specifically animal-shaped gummy candies in various colors." A photograph appeared on the courtroom display showing the clinical evidence of the colorful candy still present in the deceased child's mouth. Harper's mother stifled a sob at the image, while several jurors visibly flinched. Based on the degree of dissolution of these candies, combined with post-mortem indicators, I can state with scientific certainty that Harper died within approximately 15 to 20 minutes of placing these candies in her mouth, Dr. Winters continued, her expert voice providing clinical distance from the emotional weight of her words. The prosecutor then guided Dr. Winters through a detailed explanation of how the human body processes food, particularly sugar-based candies, and how this process stops at the moment of death. The partially dissolved state of these particular candies creates a reliable timeline marker, Dr. Winters explained, using a laser pointer to indicate specific areas on the displayed photograph. The dissolution pattern shows that Harper was alive and salivating normally when she began eating the candy, but this process was abruptly halted when she died shortly afterward. This testimony directly contradicted Benjamin's claim that Harper had left his apartment alive and gone to buy candy with money he had given her. The candy was already in her possession and being consumed when she was killed, proving she never left the apartment as Benjamin had initially claimed. Under further questioning, Dr. Winters explained how laboratory analysis had identified the specific brand and type of candy, animal-shaped gummies from Jensen's convenience store, by comparing dye compounds and sugar formulations with reference samples. Store records confirmed Harper had purchased this exact candy before school on the morning of April 20th, evidence that she already had candy in her possession when she arrived at Benjamin's apartment. In my professional opinion, Dr. Winters concluded, the state of the candy in Harper's mouth indicates she died while in the process of eating it, making it impossible for her to have left the apartment, gone to a store, purchased candy with money allegedly given to her by the defendant, and then been killed elsewhere, as originally claimed. During cross-examination, defense attorney Reynolds attempted to introduce alternative explanations for the candy evidence, suggesting Harper might have had additional candy with her that she was eating at Benjamin's apartment before leaving. Dr. Winters shook her head firmly, explaining, "The science doesn't support that theory. The dissolution pattern shows these candies were fresh in her mouth at time of death, not remnants from earlier consumption." Reynolds pressed further, questioning whether strangulation might alter the normal dissolution process, but Dr. Winters remained unshaken, citing multiple peer-reviewed studies on post-mortem indicators that supported her conclusion. The candy evidence, when combined with the timeline established by witness testimony and surveillance footage, creates a clear scientific record. Harper Bailey died in Benjamin Anderson's apartment while eating candy she already possessed, not after leaving to buy candy elsewhere. Following Dr. Winters' powerful testimony, the prosecution called forensic odontologist Dr. James Patterson, who specialized in dental evidence. Dr. Patterson provided additional scientific confirmation of the candy timeline by examining the specific pattern of sugar deposits on Harper's teeth. The distribution of sugar residue and dye particulates shows these candies had been in her mouth for approximately 10 to 15 minutes before death, he testified, supporting Dr. Winters' conclusions with independent analysis. Furthermore, the specific bite pattern on the recovered candy fragments matches Harper's dental records exactly, confirming these were the last things she consumed before death. This testimony further solidified the prosecution's argument that the candy evidence definitively placed Harper's time of death within Benjamin's apartment, contrary to his original story. The scientific testimony regarding the candy evidence was followed by perhaps the most emotionally charged witness of the trial. Victoria Murphy, the woman who had left Harper with Benjamin and then lied about it during the initial missing person investigation. Having already served 6 months of her 2-year probation sentence for obstruction of justice, Victoria appeared in court looking pale and significantly thinner than in her previous appearance, the weight of her role in Harper's death visibly affecting her physical health. As she took the stand, Victoria avoided looking at either Benjamin or the Bailey family, her gaze fixed on her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Prosecutor Davis approached her with carefully controlled anger, her questions designed to expose Victoria's negligence while also establishing her as a witness to Benjamin's deception. Ms. Murphy, could you please explain to the court your relationship to Harper Bailey and why you took her to the defendant's apartment on April 20th, 2018, Davis began. Victoria's voice trembled as she explained that she was a distant cousin of Harper's mother, occasionally helping with child care to maintain her connection to the family after a falling out over money she had borrowed and failed to repay. I saw Harper outside her school that afternoon, and she mentioned wanting to see Benjamin's new puppy that he'd been telling neighborhood kids about, Victoria testified, though surveillance footage had shown her deliberately approaching Harper rather than a chance encounter. I knew Michelle, Harper's mom, was in a meeting, so I thought I could get back in her good graces by doing something nice for Harper. When pressed about her decision to leave a 10-year-old child with a teenage boy she barely knew, Victoria broke down in tears. I knew it was wrong, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I knew Susan, Benjamin's mom, wasn't home, but I had errands to run, and I thought it would just be for an hour or so. Davis then guided Victoria through her actions after returning to find Harper supposedly gone, focusing on her deliberate choice to lie to both the Bailey family and police about having seen Harper that day. "Why did you lie, Ms. Murphy?" Davis asked directly. Victoria's answer revealed the selfishness that had contributed to the tragedy. "I was afraid of getting in trouble for leaving her there. I thought maybe she had just walked home and was fine, and no one would need to know what I'd done." The most disturbing aspect of Victoria's testimony came when she described returning to Benjamin's apartment around 4:15 p.m., approximately 2 hours after dropping Harper off. "I knocked on the door and Benjamin answered right away," she recalled. "He seemed completely normal, calm even. He told me Harper had left about 20 minutes earlier, that he'd given her money for candy, and she was walking home." According to the timeline established by forensic evidence, Harper was already dead at this point, her body likely hidden in Benjamin's bedroom while he spoke casually to Victoria through the partially open door. "Did you notice anything unusual about the apartment or Benjamin's behavior?" Davis asked. Victoria shook her head. "No, nothing. He was the same quiet kid he always was. There was a faint smell of cleaning products, but I just assumed his mom had cleaned before her shift." Defense attorney Reynolds's cross-examination of Victoria focused on establishing that Benjamin had shown no obvious signs of having just committed a violent crime, supporting the defense's argument about adolescent compartmentalization and emotional regulation. "Would you say Benjamin appeared nervous, agitated, or like someone who was hiding something terrible?" Reynolds asked. Victoria considered the question before responding. "No, he seemed completely normal. If anything, he was more polite than usual, making eye contact and asking how my day was going." This testimony, intended to support the defense's narrative about Benjamin's immaturity, ultimately reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of a calculating individual capable of extraordinary deception immediately after committing murder, a level of emotional control unusual in adolescence. The most technically complex testimony came from FBI digital forensics specialist Agent Tamara Washington, who analyzed Benjamin's online activity in the weeks leading up to Harper's murder. Agent Washington methodically walked the jury through Benjamin's internet search history, which included queries about how long does DNA last, can bleach destroy evidence, and most disturbingly, searches for websites depicting violence against young girls. The defendant's search patterns show a clear escalation in both frequency and specificity, Agent Washington testified, displaying a chart that tracked Benjamin's online behavior over the 3 months preceding Harper's murder. In particular, searches for unconscious girl and how to make someone pass out without drugs increased significantly in the 2 weeks before April 20th. Agent Washington's testimony also revealed Benjamin's research into the specific location where Harper's body was eventually found. The defendant conducted multiple searches about water depth in local canals, with particular focus on the Causeway area, she explained, showing screenshots of map searches and a water management website Benjamin had visited repeatedly. He also searched for information on how long it takes bodies to decompose in water and whether DNA can survive underwater. These searches, conducted from Benjamin's personal devices in the week before Harper's murder, provided compelling evidence of premeditation that directly contradicted the defense's argument that the crime was an impulsive act by an immature brain. Perhaps the most psychologically revealing testimony came from Dr. Eliza Morgan, the forensic psychologist who had observed Benjamin's interrogation and subsequently conducted a comprehensive evaluation of him. Dr. Morgan, with 25 years of experience evaluating violent offenders, including juveniles, provided expert analysis of Benjamin's psychological profile that challenged the defense's portrayal of him as a typical teenager with an undeveloped brain. While Mr. Anderson's biological age is 15, his psychological presentation is highly atypical for adolescents, Dr. Morgan testified. He demonstrates sophisticated cognitive abilities, particularly in areas of planning, emotional regulation, and what we call cognitive empathy, the intellectual understanding of others' emotions without the accompanying emotional response. Dr. Morgan explained that Benjamin's behavior following Harper's murder, his careful cleaning of the crime scene, construction of a false narrative, and ability to interact normally with others immediately after the killing indicated an unusual level of compartmentalization more commonly seen in adult psychopathic offenders than in adolescents. Typically, when juveniles commit violent crimes, they demonstrate poor impulse control, minimal planning, and obvious emotional disruption afterward, she explained. Mr. Anderson's behavior shows none of these adolescent markers. Instead, we see calculated planning before the act, methodical execution during the crime, and exceptional emotional control afterward. This testimony directly challenged the defense's central argument about Benjamin's actions being the result of typical adolescent brain development. The defense attempted to counter this damaging psychological assessment by calling their own expert, Dr. Lawrence Chen, a neurodevelopmental specialist who maintained that regardless of Benjamin's apparent sophistication in certain areas, his brain was still physically immature. Even adolescents, who appear highly intelligent and controlled, lack full development of the prefrontal cortex, which governs moral reasoning and true understanding of consequences, Dr. Chen testified. This is not a question of intelligence or even of knowing right from wrong in an abstract sense. It's about the neurological capacity to fully process the real-world implications of actions, especially under emotional stress. This testimony created a scientific battle of experts that left the jury with the difficult task of reconciling Benjamin's clearly premeditated actions with the undisputed fact of his neurological immaturity. The final key witness for the prosecution was Detective Owen Clark, whose methodical investigation had built the case against Benjamin. Detective Clark walked the jury through the entire timeline of the investigation, from the first missing person report to Benjamin's eventual confession, emphasizing how each piece of evidence, particularly the candy found in Harper's teeth, had systematically dismantled Benjamin's false narrative. In my 20 years of law enforcement, 15 of those investigating crimes against children, I have never encountered a juvenile suspect with this level of planning before the crime and calculation after it, Clark testified. Each time we confronted Benjamin with contradictions in his story, he would seamlessly adjust his narrative rather than becoming emotional or breaking down, as we typically see with teenage suspects. Clark's testimony included playing selected portions of Benjamin's confession, allowing the jury to hear the teenager describing in his own words how he had planned and executed Harper's murder. The courtroom fell silent as Benjamin's voice, calm and measured, explained how he had given Harper a drink containing crushed anxiety medication to make her sleepy before attempting to assault her. When Harper resisted and threatened to tell her parents, Benjamin described strangling her until she stopped moving, his tone remaining clinical throughout the recording. The jury's expressions hardened. As they listened, several looking directly at Benjamin as he sat at the defense table, his eyes downcast in what appeared to be an attempt to project remorse that had been notably absent in his recorded confession. The final moment of Detective Clark's testimony focused on Benjamin's response when asked during his interrogation if he felt sorry for what he had done to Harper. The recorded answer, "I'm sorry I got caught," echoed through the courtroom, causing Harper's mother to sob audibly, while Benjamin's own mother closed her eyes in apparent pain. This single statement, more than any other piece of evidence, seemed to crystallize for the jury the prosecution's argument that Benjamin, despite his chronological age, had demonstrated a level of calculation, moral detachment, and absence of remorse that warranted adult consequences for his actions. As Detective Clark stepped down from the witness stand, the prosecution rested its case, having methodically constructed a narrative of premeditated murder committed by a juvenile who who had demonstrated adult-like calculation throughout. After 16 days of testimony and nearly 7 hours of closing arguments, the case of State of Utah versus Benjamin Anderson was finally in the hands of the jury. Judge Martha Simmons delivered her instructions with careful precision, explaining the legal standards for first-degree murder, sexual assault of a minor, and the special circumstances that could warrant consideration of the death penalty, despite the defendant's age. You must base your decision solely on the evidence presented in this courtroom, she reminded the 12 citizens who held Benjamin's fate in their hands, not on emotion, public opinion, or personal beliefs about juvenile justice. With those final words, the jurors filed out to begin their deliberations, their faces solemn with the weight of the decision before them. The jury's departure left the courtroom in a strange limbo, with both legal teams gathering their materials while spectators whispered speculations about how long deliberations might take. Prosecutor Abigail Davis conferred quietly with Detective Owen Clark, both stealing occasional glances at Benjamin, who sat whispering with his attorney Martin Reynolds, his expression unreadable. The Bailey family huddled together in the gallery, Harper's parents flanked by relatives who had attended every day of the trial, all wearing the purple ribbons that had become a symbol of remembrance for the vibrant 10-year-old whose life had been so brutally cut short. Across the aisle, Susan Anderson sat alone, as she had throughout the trial, her isolation a physical manifestation of the social ostracism that had followed her son's arrest. As court officers cleared the courtroom for the lunch recess, media representatives rushed to secure positions for the eventual verdict announcement, the high-profile case having drawn national attention to Salt Lake City. The courthouse steps had become a makeshift studio for legal commentators dissecting every aspect of the trial, their analysis dominated by the question of whether Benjamin's age should mitigate his punishment despite the calculated nature of his crime. This case has become a lightning rod in the debate over juvenile justice reform, one prominent legal analyst explained to her viewers, pitting developmental neuroscience against the demand for accountability in particularly heinous crimes. Public opinion outside the courthouse was sharply divided, with some protesters carrying signs demanding justice for Harper, while others held placards reading, "Children don't belong on death row." Inside the jury room, the 12 men and women tasked with reaching a verdict began by methodically reviewing the evidence that had been presented over the past 3 weeks. They requested to re-examine several key exhibits, the photographs of the candy found in Harper's teeth, Benjamin's internet search history, and the transcript of his confession. The jury forewoman, a middle school principal with 20 years of experience working with adolescents, established a structured discussion process, aware that the emotional aspects of the case could easily overwhelm rational deliberation if not carefully managed. Let's begin by addressing the facts as established by the evidence, she suggested, before we consider the more complex questions about age and culpability. For the next 4 hours, the jury engaged in intense discussion, revisiting testimony from both the prosecution and defense experts regarding adolescent brain development and its implications for Benjamin's actions. There is no question his brain wasn't fully developed, one juror, a neuropsychologist, explained to his colleagues. That's established science, but the real question is whether that fact should override the clear evidence of planning and awareness of wrongdoing we've seen in this case. Another juror, a mother of teenage boys, countered, "I understand the science, but I also know teenagers are capable of understanding that rape and murder are wrong. My concern is that we're using brain development as an excuse for behavior that even a much younger child would know is unacceptable." The deliberations focused heavily on the candy evidence, which many jurors viewed as the clearest indication of Benjamin's deliberate deception. The fact that he created a story about giving her money for candy when she already had candy in her mouth when she died shows he was thinking several steps ahead, the jury forewoman noted. He wasn't just trying to hide what he'd done in the moment. He was constructing a false narrative designed to misdirect the investigation. This evidence of calculation, combined with Benjamin's internet searches before the crime and his elaborate efforts to conceal it afterward, proved persuasive to jurors wrestling with questions about adolescent decision-making capacity and moral reasoning. At 3:45 p.m., after less than 5 hours of deliberation, surprisingly quick for a case of this magnitude, the jury sent word to Judge Simmons that they had reached a verdict. As word spread through the courthouse, spectators and media representatives rushed to reclaim their seats in the courtroom, the bailiff struggling to maintain order as emotions ran high on both sides of the gallery. The Bailey family entered together, holding hands in a chain of shared grief and anxiety, while Susan Anderson was escorted in by a victim advocate who had taken pity on her isolation. Benjamin was brought in from a holding cell, his expression carefully composed into what appeared to be appropriate solemnity, though Detective Clark, watching closely, noted the calculating awareness in his eyes as he surveyed the packed courtroom. "All rise," the bailiff called, as Judge Simmons entered, her face giving no indication of her thoughts on the jury's quick decision. After the formalities of reconvening court were observed, the judge asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The forewoman stood, a manila envelope containing the verdict forms clutched in visibly trembling hands. "We have, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady despite her evident emotion. The bailiff collected the envelope and delivered it to Judge Simmons, who reviewed the forms carefully before returning them for the forewoman to read aloud. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom, broken only by the sound of Harper's mother's quiet weeping as she clutched her husband's hand. "In the case of State of Utah versus Benjamin Anderson, on the count of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty," the forewoman announced, her voice clear but solemn. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by muffled sobs from the Bailey family, while Benjamin remained eerily still, his only reaction a slight tightening of his jaw. "On the count of sexual assault of a minor, we find the defendant guilty," the forewoman continued. "On the count of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty." Each pronouncement of guilt was met with increasing emotion from spectators, while Benjamin maintained his composed facade, though close observers noted a slight tremor in his hands as the full weight of the verdict became apparent. The most consequential moment came when Judge Simmons addressed the jury regarding the death penalty recommendation, a possibility that had loomed over the proceedings due to the particularly heinous nature of the crime, despite Benjamin's age making it a controversial consideration. "Has the jury reached a recommendation regarding sentencing?" she asked. The forewoman nodded, consulting a separate form before announcing, "Your Honor, after careful consideration of all aggravating and mitigating factors, including the defendant's age, the jury unanimously recommends that the death penalty be imposed." This announcement sent shock waves through the courtroom, with audibles, reactions from both sides of the gallery, relief and vindication from Harper's supporters, horror from those who opposed capital punishment for juveniles regardless of their crimes. Benjamin's carefully maintained composure finally cracked at this pronouncement, his face paling visibly as the reality of the jury's decision registered. His mother collapsed forward in her seat, a keening sound of despair escaping her lips as the victim advocate attempted to comfort her. Across the aisle, the Bailey family embraced in a complex mixture of grief and relief, Harper's father visibly struggling to contain his emotions as he supported his weeping wife. Judge Simmons called for order, reminding everyone present that the jury's recommendation regarding the death penalty was advisory only, with final sentencing to be determined at a later hearing after pre-sentencing reports were completed. As the jury was dismissed with the court's thanks for their service, many of them appeared emotionally drained, several wiping away tears as they filed out of the courtroom. In a rare break from judicial stoicism, Judge Simmons addressed the jurors directly before they left. "You have performed one of the most difficult duties our justice system can ask of citizens, weighing evidence in a case that tests not only our legal principles, but our understanding of humanity itself. The court recognizes the burden this has placed on each of you and thanks you for your service." This acknowledgment of the emotional toll seemed to release something in several jurors, who began to weep openly as they exited, the weight of their decision visible in their expressions and postures. Outside the courthouse, the Bailey family faced a wall of cameras and microphones, Harper's father serving as spokesperson, while her mother remained too overcome with emotion to speak. "Today doesn't bring our daughter back," Robert Bailey stated, his voice breaking despite his evident effort to maintain composure. "Nothing can do that. But knowing that the person who took her from us will never have the opportunity to hurt another child gives us some measure of peace as we continue to navigate a world without our beautiful Harper." He thanked the prosecution team, Detective Clark, and the community that had supported them throughout the investigation and trial, before gently declining further questions and leading his family through the media gauntlet to waiting vehicles. Susan Anderson left through a side entrance, escorted by court officers to protect her from the angry crowds that had gathered outside the courthouse. As the mother of Salt Lake City's most reviled criminal, she had become a secondary target for community anger, facing harassment, death threats, and the loss of her nursing position at the local hospital, despite having no involvement in or knowledge of her son's actions. In a brief statement released through her attorney later that day, Susan expressed condolences to the Bailey family and asked for privacy as she struggled to reconcile the son she thought she knew with the person revealed through the trial evidence. "I lost my child too," the statement concluded, "not to death, but to something I may never understand." Benjamin himself was escorted from the courthouse in shackles, a protective vest partially visible beneath his suit jacket, as authorities took no chances with his safety during transport back to juvenile detention, where he would remain until formal sentencing. The brief glimpse reporters caught of his face showed none of the carefully performed remorse he had displayed during the trial, replaced instead by a cold anger that chilled those who witnessed it. As the secure vehicle pulled away, a veteran court reporter turned to her colleague and whispered, "That's not the face of a child who doesn't understand what he did. That's the face of someone who thought he was smarter than everyone else and just discovered he was wrong." In the days following the verdict, the case became a flashpoint for national debates about juvenile justice, with legal experts, child psychologists, and policy advocates weighing in on the implications of both the guilty verdict and the death penalty recommendation. Conservative commentators pointed to the calculated nature of Benjamin's actions as justification for treating certain juvenile offenders as adults, while reform advocates argued that no child, regardless of their crime, had a fully developed brain capable of adult moral reasoning. This verdict will almost certainly face appeals on Eighth Amendment grounds, one constitutional scholar predicted, potentially reaching the Supreme Court as a test case for juvenile capital punishment jurisprudence. For the people of Salt Lake City, the verdict brought a complex mixture of justice and uncomfortable reflection. The community that prided itself on family values and moral uprightness struggled to reconcile how a 15-year-old raised in their midst could commit such a heinous crime. Religious leaders who had remained largely silent during the trial now addressed their congregations with messages about redemption, judgment, and the theological implications of evil manifesting in the young. Many parents reported having difficult conversations with their children who had followed the case despite adults' attempts to shield them from its graphic details. The trial of Benjamin Anderson had forced a community defined by moral certainty to confront ambiguities about human nature that offered no easy resolution. On December 7, 2018, Benjamin Anderson returned to the Utah State Courthouse for his formal sentencing hearing. The same courtroom where he had been convicted, now filled with a tense anticipation that reflected the case's growing national significance. In the 7 weeks since the jury had delivered its guilty verdict and recommended the death penalty, Benjamin's case had become a lightning rod in debates about juvenile justice reform, with legal organizations from across the ideological spectrum filing amicus briefs arguing for or against the constitutionality of sentencing a 15-year-old to death. Judge Martha Simmons, acutely aware that her decision would likely be scrutinized by appellate courts for years to come, had taken the unusual step of allowing cameras in the courtroom for the sentencing, ensuring complete transparency in what she recognized as a potentially landmark ruling. Benjamin entered the courtroom in a juvenile detention uniform rather than the suits he had worn during the trial, the orange jumpsuit emphasizing both his institutional status and his physical youth. At 15 years and 8 months old, he still possessed the gangly proportions of adolescence, his height not yet filled out with adult muscle, creating a visual contradiction to the adult-like calculation described in testimony about his crime. Susan Anderson sat in the front row behind the defense table, her face drawn from weeks of stress and public harassment, while the Bailey family filled the seats behind the prosecution, joined by dozens of community members wearing purple ribbons in Harper's memory. The gallery had been carefully screened for potential disruptions, with additional security posted throughout the courthouse to manage the demonstrations that had grown outside since dawn. After the court was called to order, Judge Simmons addressed the formal aspects of the proceedings, reviewing the jury's verdict and sentencing recommendation, before announcing that she would hear impact statements from the victim's family, followed by any mitigating evidence the defense wished to present, before delivering her final ruling. This court is mindful of the constitutional questions surrounding the sentencing of juvenile offenders, Simmons noted, her voice measured and deliberate, particularly as they pertain to capital punishment. Today's decision will be guided by both established precedent and the specific circumstances of this case, recognizing that our legal system must balance justice for victims with the unique considerations applicable to youthful offenders. Michelle Bailey was the first to deliver a victim impact statement, approaching the podium with visibly trembling hands but a determined expression. For several seconds she stood in silence, looking directly at Benjamin until he dropped his gaze to the table before him. "My daughter was 10 years old," Michelle finally began, her voice stronger than many expected, given her fragile appearance throughout the trial. "Harper will never turn 11 or 16 or 21. She will never graduate, fall in love, or fulfill her dream of helping animals. When you took her life, Benjamin, you didn't just kill my little girl, you erased an entire future that should have been hers." Michelle then addressed the court more broadly, describing the devastating impact of Harper's murder on their family, her older brother's withdrawal into depression, her younger sister's night terrors, and the collapse of the parents' sense of safety and trust in their community. Robert Bailey followed his wife, his impact statement focusing on the broader implications of Harper's death for their community and society. "We raised our children to believe in the goodness of people," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We taught them to be kind, to help others, to trust that most people would treat them with the same decency they showed to the world. Harper believed that, and her belief in goodness cost her her life." He described the community's loss of innocence, the new fear that had infected their once trusting neighborhood, and the impossible task parents now faced, explaining to their children why they could no longer walk to school alone or visit friends without extensive vetting and supervision. The true measure of Harper's life isn't in its tragic ending, but in how she lived every day with compassion and joy, Robert concluded. his composure finally breaking. The true measure of our justice system will be whether it ensures no other family ever experiences this pain at Benjamin Anderson's hands. In a surprising development, Harper's 12-year-old brother asked to address the court, a request Judge Simmons granted after confirming with the prosecution and the Baileys that they supported his participation. The boy, whose name had been protected throughout the proceedings due to his age, approached the podium with his father's supportive hand on his shoulder. "I was supposed to walk Harper home from school that day," he began, his voice cracking with emotion and early adolescence. "I had baseball practice, and I didn't, and now she's gone." The raw guilt in his statement caused many in the courtroom to weep openly, including several jurors who had returned to witness the sentencing. "I want Benjamin to know that he didn't just kill my sister, he broke our whole family. Every holiday, every birthday, every normal day has a Harper-shaped hole in it, now that nothing can ever fill." Following the victim impact statements, defense attorney Martin Reynolds presented his arguments for leniency in sentencing, focusing heavily on Benjamin's age and the neuroscientific evidence regarding adolescent brain development. "Your Honor, the science is unambiguous," Reynolds argued. "The prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control, consequence assessment, and moral reasoning, is simply not fully developed in a 15-year-old brain." He cited recent Supreme Court decisions limiting juvenile sentencing, particularly Roper v. Simmons, which prohibited executing offenders who were under 18 when they committed their crimes. While the jury has recommended death, the Constitution, as interpreted by our highest court, forbids such a sentence for a defendant of Benjamin's age, regardless of the severity of the offense. Reynolds then presented testimony from Dr. Lawrence Chen, the neurodevelopmental specialist who had testified during the trial, to address specific questions about Benjamin's capacity for rehabilitation. Dr. Chen explained that while Benjamin's crime demonstrated disturbing calculation, the plasticity of the adolescent brain meant that meaningful intervention could potentially alter his developmental trajectory. The neurological structures that govern empathy and moral reasoning continue developing into the mid-20s, Dr. Chen testified. With appropriate therapeutic intervention over an extended period, there is scientific reason to believe that Benjamin's brain could develop more normative emotional and moral capacities. This testimony provided the foundation for the defense's argument that a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 25 years would better serve justice than either execution or life without parole. Susan Anderson was the final witness for the defense, approaching the stand with visible hesitation and pain. Her testimony was not aimed at excusing her son's actions, but at providing context for the court to consider in sentencing. She described Benjamin's early childhood as largely normal, noting his high intelligence, but also his difficulty connecting emotionally with peers. "I always thought he was just introverted," she explained, her voice barely audible at times. "I never saw signs that he would..." Her voice broke completely at this point, unable to articulate the horror her son had inflicted. After composing herself, Susan addressed the Bailey family directly. "I cannot ask for your forgiveness because what Benjamin did is unforgivable. I can only tell you that I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand how the child I raised could cause such suffering, and doing whatever I can to prevent another family from experiencing your pain." Prosecutor Abigail Davis's final arguments emphasized the calculating nature of Benjamin's crime, arguing that the premeditation, sexual motivation, and elaborate cover-up demonstrated a level of moral comprehension that warranted the most severe punishment available within constitutional limits. While the court must consider the defendant's chronological age, it must also consider the nature of his actions, Davis argued. Benjamin Anderson didn't commit this crime because his adolescent brain couldn't understand consequences or control impulses. He committed it after careful planning, took deliberate steps to avoid detection, and showed a complete absence of remorse except when performing for the jury. She urged the court to impose the maximum constitutional sentence, life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole, arguing that Benjamin represented an ongoing danger to society that no amount of rehabilitation could mitigate. After hearing all arguments, Judge Simmons called a 1-hour recess to finalize her decision, leaving the courtroom in tense anticipation. When court reconvened, the judge began by acknowledging the constitutional framework within which she was required to operate. The Supreme Court has clearly established that the Eighth Amendment prohibits the execution of individuals who were under 18 at the time of their crimes, she explained, regardless of the heinousness of those crimes or the apparent maturity of the defendant. Therefore, despite the jury's recommendation, the death penalty is not a sentencing option available to this court. This statement caused visible relief among death penalty opponents in the gallery, while several members of the Bailey family closed their eyes in disappointed acceptance of this legal reality. Judge Simmons then turned to the question of whether life without parole was an appropriate sentence for a 15-year-old offender, addressing the Supreme Court's guidance in Miller v. Alabama that such sentences for juveniles should be uncommon and imposed only after considering the distinctive attributes of youth. Having reviewed all evidence presented during both the trial and the sentencing proceedings, the judge continued, this court finds that Benjamin Anderson's crime demonstrates exactly the rare combination of circumstances that justify a sentence of life without the possibility of parole despite his youth. She methodically outlined the factors supporting this conclusion: the premeditated nature of the crime, the sexual assault component, the elaborate efforts to conceal evidence, and the psychological evaluation suggesting an unusual lack of capacity for empathy or remorse. With formal language that belied the emotional weight of the moment, Judge Simmons pronounced her sentence: Benjamin Anderson, having been found guilty of murder in the first degree and sexual assault of a minor, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The judge then added specific provisions requiring Benjamin to receive ongoing psychological evaluation and treatment, though she noted that these measures were aimed at understanding rather than eventual release. While the defendant's age has been considered as a mitigating factor, she concluded, the calculated nature of his crime and the comprehensive evidence of his understanding of its wrongfulness outweigh the general presumption against such severe sentences for juvenile offenders. The pronouncement of this sentence, the harshest constitutionally permissible for a 15-year-old, was met with a complex mixture of reactions throughout the courtroom. The Bailey family embraced in a combination of grief and vindication, while Susan Anderson sat motionless, her expression suggesting neither surprise nor protest at the severity of her son's punishment. Benjamin himself maintained the same careful composure he had demonstrated throughout most of the proceedings, though close observers noted a momentary flash of something like relief when death was officially removed as a possibility, followed by a hardening of his expression at the realization that he would never be released. As Benjamin was escorted from the courtroom to begin his sentence at a specialized juvenile facility where he would remain until his 18th birthday before transfer to adult prison, the impact of his case on juvenile justice debates was already becoming apparent. Legal commentators immediately began dissecting Judge Simmons's ruling, with some arguing it pushed the boundaries of Miller versus Alabama, while others defended it as precisely the kind of extraordinary case the Supreme Court had acknowledged might warrant life without parole, despite a defendant's youth. The sentence would ultimately be appealed through multiple levels of the judicial system, with the Supreme Court eventually declining to hear the case in 2022, effectively upholding the sentence and establishing Benjamin's case as a reference point for future juvenile sentencing decisions. The ripple effects of the case extended far beyond the legal system, profoundly impacting everyone connected to it. Victoria Murphy, whose negligence had created the opportunity for Harper's murder, completed her probation but found herself unable to rebuild her life in Salt Lake City, eventually moving to another state and changing her name to escape the association with the case. Emma Wilson, Benjamin's former girlfriend, who had unwittingly helped dispose of Harper's body, required extensive therapy to address her trauma and guilt, eventually becoming an advocate for education about recognizing warning signs of dangerous behavior in adolescent relationships. Detective Owen Clark, haunted by the images of Harper's autopsy and Benjamin's chilling lack of remorse, retired from active police work 2 years after the case concluded, transitioning to training new detectives in investigating crimes against children. The Bailey family established the Harper Bailey Foundation, which focused on child safety education and support for families affected by violent crime. The foundation's most significant initiative was the Purple Ribbon Alert System, modeled after Amber Alerts, but specifically designed to mobilize community resources when children went missing under circumstances that didn't meet the criteria for statewide notifications. The system, first implemented in Utah and later adopted by several other states, created neighborhood-level response protocols that could be activated within minutes of a child being reported missing, addressing the critical early period before formal police investigations might be fully mobilized. Susan Anderson, perhaps the most isolated victim of her son's actions, faced an impossible position in the community that had once been her home. Unable to deny the evidence of Benjamin's guilt, yet devastated as a mother, she found herself ostracized by former friends and colleagues, many of whom seemed to hold her somehow responsible for not recognizing the darkness in her child. After receiving death threats and having her home vandalized multiple times, Susan eventually relocated to another state, where she volunteered with organizations focused on early intervention for troubled children while maintaining anonymous monthly contributions to the Harper Bailey Foundation, a private atonement for a crime she hadn't committed but couldn't escape. Benjamin Anderson himself became a subject of intense psychological study, with researchers seeking to understand how a 15-year-old could commit such a calculated crime and show so little emotional response to its consequences. Initial assessments suggested a combination of antisocial personality traits and high intelligence that had allowed him to mimic normal emotional responses while lacking the internal emotional structures that typically prevent violent behavior. As he matured in the controlled environment of incarceration, Benjamin demonstrated an intellectual understanding of why his actions were wrong, but continued to show deficits in genuine empathy or remorse, confirming for many the appropriateness of his sentence, while raising troubling questions about whether earlier intervention might have identified his dangerous tendencies before they culminated in Harper's murder. The case's most lasting impact on Salt Lake City was the profound shift in community practices regarding child supervision and safety. The religious community that had once prided itself on being a safe haven where children could move freely became notably more vigilant, with formalized buddy systems for walking to school, strict protocols for adult supervision of youth activities, and enhanced background check requirements for anyone working with children. While these measures undoubtedly improved safety, they also represented a painful loss of innocence for a community that had believed itself somehow protected from the darkest aspects of human behavior by its moral values and close-knit social structure. 5 years after Harper's murder, on what would have been her 15th birthday, the city dedicated a small park near her former elementary school as Harper's Haven, featuring a butterfly garden and animal-themed play structures that reflected her love of nature and creatures. The dedication ceremony brought together many who had been involved in the case: the Bailey family, Detective Clark, Prosecutor Davis, and hundreds of community members, but also highlighted the absent figures whose lives had been permanently altered. Benjamin serving his life sentence, Susan living in anonymity in another state, Victoria struggling to rebuild her life under a new identity. The ceremony concluded with the release of Purple Butterflies, a moment of beauty emerging from tragedy that served as a poignant metaphor for the community's ongoing journey toward healing. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the case was its impact on the national conversation about juvenile justice, forcing a more nuanced discussion that acknowledged both the developmental realities of adolescent brains and the rare instances where juveniles commit crimes with adult-like calculation. Legal scholars often cited Benjamin Anderson's case when discussing the limits of age-based leniency, while child development experts pointed to the case as evidence of the need for better early identification of potentially dangerous behavioral patterns in children. The tension between these perspectives would continue to shape juvenile justice reform efforts for years to come, with Benjamin's case serving as a complex reference point that defied simple categorization or easy resolution. As the 10th anniversary of Harper's death approached in 2028, a documentary filmmaker attempted to interview Benjamin Anderson, now in his mid-20s and housed in maximum security adult prison. His response to the interview request revealed perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his legacy. "I'm interested in participating, but only if you can tell me how famous the case has made me. Am I still remembered? Do people still talk about what I did?" This response focused entirely on his own notoriety rather than the damage he had caused, confirmed for many the correctness of Judge Simmons's assessment a decade earlier, that in Benjamin Anderson's case, the distinctive attributes of youth were unfortunately overshadowed by a profound moral emptiness that no amount of development or rehabilitation could fill.